Everyone thinks they know the story of Elden Ring. But what if I told you that the lands between is not a land at all, but is actually the decomposing corpse of a god so vast that its body became geography, and that every location you explore, every mountain you climb, and every cavern you descend into is actually a different organ system of a deity that the greater will murdered and hollowed out to use as a prison for something even more terrifying than itself? The map you traverse is not terrain, but is anatomy, and once you see the body, you cannot unsee it, because every design choice, every geographical feature, and every inexplicable detail suddenly makes perfect, horrifying sense. Look at the map right now, and really look at the shape of the lands between. Notice how the landmass curves in a way that suggests something organic rather than geological. Notice how the Erd tree stands at the center like a spine or a central nervous system. Notice how the divine towers are positioned at points that correspond exactly to where a massive being's chakra points or energy centers would be located. Notice how the underground rivers flow in patterns that mirror circulatory systems. This is not coincidence or artistic license, but is FromSoftware showing us the truth in the only way they could without making it too obvious, because the implications are too disturbing for most players to accept. The name Lands Between suddenly takes on a completely different meaning when you realize it is not describing a location between other lands, but is describing the state between life and death that a corpse occupies in the moments after death before decay fully sets in. The lands between is stuck in that transitional moment stretched across thousands of years because the greater will needed the corpse to remain fresh enough to be inhabitable but dead enough that it could not resist what was being done to it. Every location in the game exists in this twilight state where death has occurred but has not been allowed to complete its natural process. Farum Azula is the most obvious evidence because it exists outside of time, entirely floating in a space that should not be accessible from normal reality. But here is what nobody realizes and what changes everything about how we understand the timeline. Farum Azula is not outside time because of some dragon magic or ancient cataclysm, but because it is the brain of the corpse god. And the brain is the last part of the body to accept that death has occurred. Farum Azula is still firing electrical impulses, still processing information, still trying to command a body that no longer responds, and its existence outside time is actually the subjective experience of those final neurons firing stretched into eternity. Placidus Sax, the Dragon Lord who waits in Farum, Azula is not waiting for his god to return, but he's waiting for the body to die completely so that the consciousness trapped in the brain can finally be released. He serves as Elden Lord to a god that fled, but that god did not flee from anything external, but fled inward, retreating into the deepest parts of the corpse's dying brain, trying to hide from the greater will's invasion. Placidus Sax has been frozen in that moment of waiting since before time began, because from his perspective, inside the brain of a being experiencing time non-linearly, his vigil has been both infinite and instantaneous. The dragons themselves are not native to the lands between, but are antibodies that the corpse god created to fight off the greater will's infection. Their stone scales are not armor, but are calcification. The body's attempt to create barriers around the infection to prevent it from spreading. Their lightning is not elemental magic, but is the electrical impulses of a nervous system trying desperately to reboot itself to shock the body back to life. When we fight dragons, we are not battling monsters, but are fighting the corpse. God's immune response, which still activates automatically even though the consciousness that directed it has retreated into hiding. The ancient dragon cult that Godwin befriended was not a religion, but was a support group for beings who knew the truth about what the lands between actually was, and who were trying to find a way to either resurrect the corpse god or mercy kill it completely. Godwin's golden lightning that he developed after befriending the dragons was not just combining his power with theirs, but was him learning to interface directly with the corpse god's nervous system. He was attempting to become a new brain to replace Farum Azula to provide the corpse god with a consciousness that could operate in linear time and finally allow it to either live or die properly. This is why Marika had to orchestrate Godwin's death, and why it had to be so specifically strange with his soul dying, but his body living. She was not trying to kill her son, but was trying to transform him into something that could accomplish what he had been attempting with the dragons, but in a way the greater will would not detect until it was too late. Godwin's body spreading roots throughout the lands between is not corruption or undeath, but is him literally merging with the corpse. God's root system connecting himself to every part of its decaying anatomy. He is becoming a replacement nervous system, growing through the body like new neural pathways, bypassing the damaged brain in Far Mazula. The Death Prince face that appears in different locations is not Godwin's corpse, but is his new form of awareness manifesting at multiple points throughout the body simultaneously. Each face is like a neuron, and together they form a distributed consciousness that exists throughout the entire corpse, God rather than being centralized in one location. Those who live in death are not mindless undead, but are people who have been integrated into Godwin's new neural network, their individual consciousness preserved, but now part of a greater collective awareness. They attack us not from madness, but because the network recognizes that we serve the greater will and must be stopped. But let me take you even deeper into the anatomy of this cosmic corpse, because once you know what to look for, the evidence is overwhelming and appears in every region. Limgrave is not just a starting area, but is the left hand of the corpse god, which is why it is relatively intact and functional, because hands are extremities that take longer to decay. The fingers throughout the game are not coincidental, but are literal representations of the body's digits manifested in different forms. The two fingers that guide the Golden Order are actually the index and middle finger of the corpse god's right hand, severed and reanimated by the greater will to serve as puppets. The three fingers deep beneath Langdell are the ring pinky and thumb of that same hand still connected to the rest of the body and trying to burn everything to free the corpse god from its undead state. Liurnia is the stomach and digestive system, which is why it is filled with water and sits lower than the surrounding areas, like a basin designed to collect and process material. The Academy of Raya Lucaria sits at the center of this organ, studying the primeval current, which is not cosmic energy, but is the corpse god's digestive fluids still active and breaking down matter into pure energy. The glintstone sorceries are not magic, but are techniques for manipulating these digestive enzymes, using them to break down reality itself, the same way the corpse god once broke down food into fuel. When sorcerers go mad from studying the primeval current, they are being digested by it, their consciousness dissolved and absorbed just like food. Renala's rebirth miracle, using the amber egg, is not creating new life, but is accessing the corpse god's reproductive system, which still functions on a biological level, even though the consciousness is gone. The egg is not metaphorical, but is an actual ovum from the corpse god, preserved in amber and still capable of generating life when properly stimulated. Every rebirth creates not a new person, but a clone, using the genetic material stored in that ancient egg, which is why all the sweetings look similar, and why the process sometimes fails, creating malformed beings. Renala is not mad from grief, but from the horror of understanding what she is actually doing each time she performs the rebirth, touching the reproductive organs of a dead god. Kaled is the right lung, which is why it is so vast and has that strange spongy quality to its geography, with areas of dense matter separated by empty spaces. The scarlet rot is not a disease brought by Malenia, but is lung cancer, metastasizing through the tissue as the organ finally begins its terminal decay. The swamp of Ionia where Malenia bloomed is ground zero for the rot, not because she caused it, but because she was drawn there by the scarlet rot god that lives in the decay itself. The outer god of rot is not invading from outside, but has always been present as the natural decomposition that occurs in dead tissue, and it has finally grown strong enough to manifest consciousness. The lake of rot deep underground is not just a body of water, but is the fluid that filled the lung before death, partially drained but still present in the lowest cavities. Astel and the other malformed stars that dwell there are not aliens, but are mutations that grew in that fluid, feeding on the decaying tissue and evolving into new forms of life. They are literally cancer, that became sentient, and their ability to manipulate gravity is them interfacing with the corpse god's cellular structure at a level so fundamental they can affect how matter itself behaves. When Astal destroys the eternal cities, it is not an invasion, but is the cancer spreading, consuming everything it touches. Altus Plateau is the chest cavity raised high above the other regions, because the ribs provide structural support that keeps this area elevated, even as the rest of the body sinks and settles. Lanedale sits atop the heart, which is why the city is circular, like a cardiac chamber, and why the Erd tree's roots penetrate so deeply here. The Greater Will did not choose this location randomly, but specifically built its capital inside the heart, because controlling the heart means controlling the circulation of power throughout the entire body. The golden sap that flows from the Erd tree is not divine blessing, but is embalming fluid being pumped through the corpse, God's circulatory system preserving the body and preventing natural decay. The divine towers scattered throughout the lands between are not communication arrays or monuments, but are acupuncture needles driven deep into the corpse, God's pressure points. Each tower sits at a location corresponding to a major meridian in the body's energy system. And the great rooms must be activated at these towers because the needles are blocking the flow of power. When you climb a divine tower and restore a great room, you are not activating its power, but are removing a seal that was placed there to prevent the corpse god's energy from flowing to that particular region. The Greater Will needed these seals to keep different parts of the body isolated to prevent them from coordinating a resurrection. The bridges connecting the divine towers to the mainland are broken not from age or war, but were deliberately destroyed after the towers were positioned to ensure that only those with the ability to traverse impossible spaces could reach them. The Greater Will knew that eventually someone might figure out what the towers actually were and try to remove the seal, so it made access as difficult as possible. But it had to leave the possibility of access open because the seals need to be periodically maintained and adjusted, which is why the gargoyles and other guardians remain protecting roots that should not exist. Mountaintops of the Giants is the head of the corpse god positioned at the highest point because that is where the skull sits atop the spine. The fire giant is not a survivor of a defeated race, but is the corpse god's pineal gland still active and still generating the flame of consciousness that could reignite the entire being if allowed to burn freely. The fell god that the giants worship is not a separate entity, but is the corpse god itself remembered in the one part of the body that still maintains awareness. When Queen Marika destroyed the giants, she was not preventing a threat, but was lobotomizing the corpse god, removing its ability to wake up naturally. The forge of the giants, where the flame of ruin burns, is the exact center of the skull, where thought becomes action, where consciousness generates reality. This is why only this flame can burn the Erd tree, because the Erd tree is a parasite embedded in the corpse god's heart, and only fire from the head contains the authority to override the body's preservation instincts. When you burn the thorns sealing the Erd tree, you are not just removing an obstacle, but are sending a signal from the brain to the heart, commanding it to stop pumping to allow death to finally complete its process. Consecrated Snowfield and Michaela's Halig tree represent the corpse god's hair, which continues to grow even after death as metabolic processes in the follicles slowly exhaust themselves. The Halig tree is not a replacement for the Erd tree, but is the corpse god's body trying one last time to generate new growth to prove it can still sustain life. Michaela chose this location because he understood what it represented and believed he could use the body's residual growth potential to transform himself into a new consciousness for the corpse god. His cocoon is not hiding him, but is integrating him into the biological processes still active in the hair follicles. The snow that falls eternally in this region is not weather, but is dandruff, the flaking of dead skin cells from the scalp as the tissue finally begins to break down completely. The albinorics who gather here are drawn by something they do not understand but feel instinctively, which is that this region represents birth and potential even in death. They are artificial life seeking the one place where natural life still tries to assert itself, hoping that proximity to authentic biological processes will make them more real. Now let us discuss the underground regions, because their existence and structure reveal perhaps the most disturbing truth about the corpse god's anatomy. Shofrariva, Ainsel, River, Deep Root Depths, and Lake of Rot are not separate underground areas, but are all part of the same system, viewed from different entry points. They represent the corpse god's vascular and lymphatic systems, the pipes and channels that once carried fluids throughout the body. The stone coffins that serve as teleporters are not magical, but are nodes in the circulatory system points, where different vessels connect, allowing movement between distant parts of the body. The eternal cities were not banished underground as punishment, but were built there deliberately by people who understood the truth and wanted to live inside the corpse god rather than on its surface. They knew that the interior of the body was more sacred than the exterior because it represented the private inner spaces that the outer world never sees. The artificial night sky they created is not mimicking the surface sky, but is showing what the view looks like from inside a body looking up at the membrane that separates interior from exterior. The stars they painted are not stars, but are pores in the skin, allowing tiny points of light to penetrate from outside. The ancestral spirits worshipped by the underground civilizations are not nature gods, but are cellular memory. The information stored in every cell of the corpse god's body about what it once was. When the followers dissolve into light and rejoin the spirits, they are not dying, but are releasing their individual consciousness to merge with the biological memory of the cells around them. They become living information stored in undead tissue, waiting for the day when the corpse god resurrects and will need memories to know who it once was. The singing bats and the oracle envoys with their bubbles are not random creatures, but are the corpse god's white blood cells still trying to fight infection, even though there is no longer a functioning immune system to coordinate their efforts. The bubbles are not attacks, but are how white blood cells actually work in reality, surrounding foreign objects to isolate and destroy them. When these creatures attack us, they are doing exactly what they were designed to do, recognizing that we carry the greater will's influence and attempting to eliminate the infection. Nokran's Fingerslayer blade was not created to kill gods in general, but was forged specifically to sever the connections between the corpse god's organs and the greater will's control mechanisms. It is not a weapon, but is a surgical tool designed to cut away the parasite without killing the host. The Nox failed not because their blade was weak, but because they did not understand that the greater will had already anticipated this possibility and had woven itself so deeply into the corpse god systems that removing it would kill the host anyway. The Fingerslayer blade works perfectly, but using it reveals that the patient is already too far gone to save. The Claymen and their bubbling magic are partially metamorphosed tissue cells that were in the process of transforming from one type to another when death occurred and are now frozen in a transitional state. Their malleable, clay-like bodies are not magical, but are literal, showing what cells look like when they are changing function. They guard the underground areas because they are the immune system's last line of defense, protecting the deepest, most vulnerable parts of the body. Their horns and primitive appearance are not devolution, but are them reverting to the most basic cellular form, the blueprint from which all other tissue types derive. Here is where the conspiracy reaches its most profound level, because everything I have told you so far is merely the foundation for understanding Marika's true plan and why the shattering was necessary. Marika discovered the truth about the lands between being a corpse and realized that she herself was not a god, but was a tumor that the greater will had cultivated inside the heart tissue. Her golden radiance was not divine, but was bioluminescence, the glow of cancerous cells reproducing out of control. Everything she built was part of the tumor's growth, spreading the greater will's influence throughout the body, disguised as civilization and order. The horror of this realization is what drove her to rebel, but she understood that simply destroying herself would not free the corpse god, because the greater will would just grow another tumor. She needed to do something so catastrophic that it would shock the entire body into an immune response that could finally reject the greater will entirely. Shattering the Elden Ring was not breaking a set of laws, but was deliberately triggering a systemic crisis. A total organ failure that would force the corpse god's autonomic systems to reboot. She turned herself into poison, knowing that sometimes the only way to kill cancer is to merely kill the patient. Each demigod who claimed a shard of the Elden Ring represents a different type of cellular response to the crisis she created. Godric grafts flesh, trying to regenerate damaged tissue through brute force accumulation. Ricard merges with the serpent, attempting to digest and repurpose the threat from within. Renala retreats into reproduction, trying to birth a solution to the problem. Radahn holds back the stars, preventing external contamination while the body fights internal infection. Malenia becomes the rot, accepting that sometimes healthy tissue must be sacrificed to stop cancer from spreading. Mohg embraces blood, attempting to strengthen the circulatory system to flush out toxins. Morgott guards the heart, trying to keep the core organs functioning while everything else fails. Miquella alone understood the full scope of Marika's plan because he inherited her capacity for long-term strategic thinking. His eternal youth is not a curse, but is him maintaining himself in a stem cell state capable of differentiating into whatever type of tissue the corpse god needs to complete its resurrection. He is not sleeping in his cocoon, but is integrating himself into the body at a cellular level, becoming not a parasite like the Greater Will, but a symbiont who can guide the resurrection from within. When he awakens, he will not be Miquella anymore, but will be the corpse god's new brain, replacing Farum Azula with a consciousness that understands both the modern world and the ancient body. Saint Trina, who is Miquella's other self, represents the dream state that the corpse god has been trapped in since death. Sleep in Elden Ring is not rest, but is the space between consciousness and unconsciousness, where the corpse god's awareness still lingers. The lily that induces sleep is not a flower, but is a gland that produces the neurotransmitters associated with dreaming, and Saint Trina's power comes from direct access to the corpse god's pineal gland, where dream chemicals are manufactured. When you are put to sleep by Saint Trina's magic, you are experiencing what the corpse god experiences, a perpetual twilight state where consciousness persists but cannot interact with the physical world. The merchants buried alive beneath Lendo were not punished for heresy, but were buried because they discovered the truth about the corpse god and tried to communicate with its dreaming consciousness. The frenzied flame they carry is not madness, but is the corpse god's response to finally being acknowledged after centuries of isolation. The flame wants to burn everything because the corpse god has been trapped in its decaying body for so long that it sees destruction as mercy. The Three Fingers are trying to help the corpse god die completely because they understand that resurrection may no longer be possible and that eternal undeath is worse than oblivion. Shabriri, the most reviled man in history, was not evil, but was the first person to successfully communicate with the corpse god's dreaming mind. What he learned drove him to madness, not because the knowledge was incomprehensible, but because it was too comprehensible, too clear, too obviously true. He saw that everyone in the lands between is a parasite living in and feeding on a god that cannot consent to being consumed, and he could not bear the moral weight of that revelation. He advocates for the frenzied flame, not from nihilism, but from compassion, believing that if we cannot free the corpse god from its torture, then we owe it the mercy of ending everything so it can finally rest. The Dung Eater's obsession with defilement through his omen curse makes perfect sense in this context, because omens are the corpse god's original form before the Greater Will's modifications. The growths and horns that mark omens are not mutations, but are the body trying to remember its true shape. By cursing everyone to be reborn as omens, the Dung Eater is attempting to reverse engineer the Greater Will's genetic manipulation, restoring the population to a form compatible with the corpse god. His method is horrific, but his goal is actually aligned with Marika's. He is trying to create a population that the corpse god would recognize as its own cells rather than as invading parasites. Fia's deathbed companionship and her goal of creating a mending rune from Godwyn connects to this because she understands that Godwyn is becoming the corpse god's new nervous system. By lying with those who are dying, she collects their final thoughts, their death awareness, and weaves it into a rune that can integrate consciousness and death into one system. Her rune does not restore death to the lands between, but teaches the corpse god how to die properly by giving it access to the death experiences of thousands of individuals who can show it that death is not an ending, but a transition. She is essentially creating an instruction manual for dying, written in the language of lived experience. Goldmask's pursuit of perfect order seems insane until you realize he is trying to calculate the exact configuration of the Elden Ring that would allow the corpse god's body to function optimally. He is not studying theology, but physiology, trying to understand how a god's body should work and what laws would govern its biological processes. His silence is not mysticism but is intense concentration as he performs calculations so complex that speaking would disrupt them. The mending rune he creates is not about morality or justice, but is a blueprint for how to restart the corpse, God's autonomous function, so it can live without requiring constant intervention. Brother Corhin's faith crisis when he sees Goldmask's vision is not about religious doubt, but is about the horror of realizing that everything he worshipped as divine law is actually just cellular biology. The golden order he dedicated his life to is not sacred commandments, but is operating instructions for organs, and his prayers are not reaching a god, but are chemical signals trying to trigger responses in dead tissue. He cannot accept this because it means his entire life has been spent not serving divinity, but serving meat. The loathsome Dungeon's throne in the sewers beneath Landel is significant because sewers represent the corpse god's waste elimination system, and he sits at the center of it because he understands that this is where the truth can be found. What a body excretes reveals what it has consumed, and by studying the waste he has learned what the greater will has been feeding on. His curse is designed to poison the waste stream, to make the population so toxic that the greater will cannot digest them, creating a backup that will eventually force the parasite to either leave or die from malnutrition. The tarnished are not exiles called back to restore order, but are white blood cells that Marika created and sent outside the body specifically, so they could re-enter later without being recognized as part of the system. By removing grace and exiling us, she marked us as foreign, which paradoxically makes us invisible to the greater will's detection because it only watches for threats from within. When grace returns and guides us back, we slip past the defenses because we register as external contamination, too minor to worry about until we have already penetrated deep enough to do real damage. Our inability to truly die is not because of grace, but because we are not alive in the conventional sense. We are antibodies existing in a quantum state where we are simultaneously part of the body and separate from it. Each death resets us to our last stable configuration at a site of grace because we are not individuals but are instances of a defensive protocol. The greater will cannot kill us permanently because doing so would require acknowledging that the body has an immune system, which would mean admitting the corpse god is still alive at some level. The guidance of grace showing us where to go is not divine providence, but is chemical signaling. The corpse god's cells crying out for help and our white blood cell nature automatically following those distress signals to their source. We are drawn to the demigods, not by choice, but by biological imperative because they represent the sites of greatest infection where the crisis is most severe. Every boss we kill is not a villain we defeat, but is a malfunctioning organ we shut down to prevent it from damaging the rest of the system. The remembrances we gain from major bosses are not trophies or power-ups, but are cellular memory transferred to us so we can understand what each part of the body was trying to accomplish. When we trade remembrances for items or spells, we are not shopping, but are expressing that memory in physical form, converting information into matter the way the body converts, DNA into proteins. The weapons and magic we gain are not rewards, but are tools encoded in the corpse, God's genetic memory for fighting exactly the kind of parasitic infection the greater will represents. Spirit ashes that allow us to summon helpers are not necromancy, but are accessing the corpse god's memory of creatures that once lived in and on its body when it was healthy. The spirits are not ghosts, but are the body remembering what a functional ecosystem looked like and temporarily manifesting that memory with enough solidity to interact with the present. The FP cost to summon them is not mana, but is cellular energy being diverted from our own processes to fuel the memory manifestation. Torret the spectral steed is not a mount, but is the corpse god's sense of momentum given form. The ability to ride Torrent is not a gift from Melina, but is the body recognizing us as a white blood cell and providing us with the cellular machinery needed to move quickly through the vast distances of its geography. When Torrent dies and must be revived, the body is not losing a creature, but is having to rebuild the biological motor that allows rapid cellular transport. The sites of grace where we can summon Torrent are locations where the circulatory system still functions well enough to generate momentum. Melina herself is not a person, but is apoptosis, given consciousness, the cellular process by which the body sacrifices its own cells for the greater good. Her burnt and bodiless state is not damage, but is her essential nature as a cell that has already begun the death process, but maintains awareness long enough to guide other cells to where they need to sacrifice themselves. When she burns at the Forge of the Giants, she is not dying, but is fulfilling her fundamental purpose as programmed cell death, showing the body that sacrifice is how healing begins. Her promise to hunt us if we take the frenzied flame is not revenge, but is the body's fail. Safe mechanism: if apoptosis fails, then necrosis must occur. If we choose to burn everything, we reveal that we are not a healthy white blood cell, but are a cancer cell that must be destroyed before we spread. Her gloam-colored eye when she makes this threat is her accessing the ancient immune protocol stored in the corpse god's deepest memory, the kill-on-sight responses to threats that cannot be reasoned with. The round table hold exists outside normal space because it represents the bone marrow, where white blood cells are created and briefed before being sent out into the body. The other tarnished we meet. There are other instances of the immune response, each designed slightly differently to handle different types of threats. The burning of the round table hold happens when the body realizes it can no longer produce enough white blood cells to fight the infection and begins shutting down non-essential production to conserve energy for core functions. Hoog's task to forge a god-slaying weapon is not a curse, but is him working as a ribosome, creating the specific protein that can break down the greater will structure. He cannot leave because ribosomes are fixed in place, and he cannot remember his purpose, because ribosomes do not have consciousness, they just follow chemical instructions. The weapon he creates is not made of metal, but is an antibody perfectly shaped to fit into the greater will's receptors and deactivate it. When we wield that weapon, we are not fighting with a sword, but are deploying a biological weapon that only we as white blood cells can carry to the infection's core. Gideon the All-Knowing's madness comes from learning too much cellular memory until he can see all the body's history simultaneously. He knows that every previous immune response has failed and assumes ours will too, which is why he tries to stop us. What he does not understand is that Marika designed us differently than previous attempts, incorporating the one element that past white blood cells lacked, which is the capacity to choose to rebel against our programming if necessary. We can become the frenzied flame or serve the three fingers or follow Ronnie into the stars because we are the first immune response with free will. Nefeli Lu in her adoption by Gideon represents cellular differentiation gone right, while Dung Eater represents it gone wrong. But both are experiments in creating new types of cells that can handle threats the old types cannot. Kenneth Haight, trying to find a proper ruler for Limgrave, is a local cell trying to re-establish tissue organization after the centralized control system failed. Dialos, learning courage, is a cell discovering its function after being created without clear instructions. Every NPC quest is a different cell's journey to understand its role in the body's healing. The bell bearings we collect from dead merchants and give to the Twin Maiden husks represent permission to access the resources that those cells had gathered. The husks are not shopkeepers, but are a storage organelle like a vacuole that can hold many different types of resources and distribute them as needed. They have no personality or awareness, because organelles do not need consciousness, they just need to function. The fact that we can kill NPCs for their bell bearings is not game mechanics, but is us as white blood cells, having the authority to break down any cell in the body and repurpose its components if necessary for survival. The walking mausoleums are not monuments, but are the corpse, God's memories of its own children attempting to preserve themselves as the body dies. They walk because memory is not static, but is actively maintained through rehearsal and repetition. Each step they take is the body reminding itself that these beings once existed, that it once had offspring and purpose. When we stop them and use them to duplicate remembrances, we are accessing the backup copies the body made in case the original memories were corrupted, which they were when the greater will infected the heart. Now let us examine the most crucial element of all, which is what the Elden Ring actually is at the fundamental level. It is not a ring of light or a set of runes, but is the corpse god's DNA, the genetic code that determines how its cells should function and interact. Marika did not shatter a physical object, but caused a mutation that broke the genetic sequence into fragments. Each great rune carried by the demigods is not political power, but is a gene, and their war is cells competing to see which genetic expression will dominate the body's future development. The Elden Beast, as the living incarnation of the Elden Ring, is not a god, but is the corpse god's DNA given form and consciousness. It swims through the heart like a chromosome moving through cellular fluid, and its attacks using light and gravity are how genetic information asserts itself over cellular function. When we fight it, we are not battling divinity, but are engaging in gene therapy, attempting to edit the DNA to remove the greater will's modifications and restore the original genetic sequence. Radagon's attempt to repair the Elden Ring is DNA trying to fix its own damage using cellular repair mechanisms, but he is using the wrong template because he himself is a product of the corrupted genes. He cannot restore what he does not remember, and his failures create more mutations, compounding the genetic damage. The hammer he uses is not a tool, but is an enzyme that should be able to repair DNA breaks, but keeps making errors because the reference sequence it checks against has itself been altered. Marika and Radagon being the same person makes perfect sense as DNA's double helix structure. They are complementary strands that should work together to maintain genetic stability, but have become contradictory because the sequence has been scrambled. Their union and separation represents DNA unwinding and rewinding as it attempts to replicate and transcribe itself. The mystery of how they can be both one and two is resolved when you understand they are not people, but are information existing in a biological medium that can take various physical forms. The two fingers reading the greater will's guidance are not communicating with an external god, but are reading the modified DNA sequence and interpreting it as commandments. They are literally fingers of genetic material pointing to different parts of the code and saying, "This is how things should work." Their guidance becomes contradictory and erratic because they are reading a corrupted sequence full of errors and gaps trying to make sense of genetic nonsense. They wait for clarity that never comes because the signal they are trying to receive is actually just noise from broken genes. The rune of death that Malekith guards is not a mystical concept, but is the genetic sequence for apoptosis, the code that tells cells when and how to die properly. Removing it from the Elden Ring was not making people immortal, but was deleting the suicide command from the DNA, leaving cells unable to kill themselves even when damaged or infected. This is literally how cancer works. Cells that have lost the genetic instructions for death and therefore grow without limit. The entire Golden Order is a civilization-scale tumor because its constituent cells cannot die and therefore cannot be replaced with healthy new growth. The Black Knife assassins who stole a fragment of death were not thieves, but were genetic engineers who extracted the apoptosis gene and weaponized it, creating a tool that could force cells to execute their death programming even though it had been deleted from the main sequence. Their knives are not metal, but are needles that inject the death gene directly into the target, causing immediate and irreversible apoptosis. Godwin's strange death makes sense because they only injected part of the sequence, the part that kills consciousness, but not the part that breaks down the physical structure, leading to a body that remains intact while the awareness dies. Ranni's plot to steal death was not about escaping fate, but about regaining access to the genetic code for transformation. She needed the death sequence not to die, but to trigger metamorphosis, because the same genes that control cell death also control cell transformation. By killing her body but preserving her soul in a doll, she essentially went into a pupal stage like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Her new form is not a curse, but is a self-directed evolution using the apoptosis genes to break down her old structure and rebuild it according to a new template. The moon she serves represents the external influence that the corpse god's genetics are vulnerable to, just as radiation from space can cause mutations. The dark moon is not an entity, but is a wavelength of energy that interacts with DNA in specific ways, causing predictable changes. Rani's sorcery using cold and moon magic is her manipulating the same forces that cause genetic drift steering evolution in directions the original code never intended. Her ending, where she takes the Elden Ring into the stars, is her removing the corpse god's DNA from the local environment so that external cosmic forces can mutate it beyond the greater will's ability to control. The stars that Radahn holds back are not celestial bodies, but are mutagenic influences from outside the closed system of the corpse god's body. Each falling star brings new genetic information, foreign DNA that could recombine with the local sequences, creating hybrids that might be better suited to survival or might be catastrophic failures. Radahn prevents this because uncontrolled mutation during a systemic crisis would be fatal. But Ranni wants it because she knows that the current genetic dead end requires outside input to escape. Their conflict is conservative genes trying to preserve the sequence versus radical genes willing to risk everything on mutation. Astil, natural born of the void, and the other malformed stars are the result of previous genetic contamination from space-creating life forms based on both the corpse god's DNA and whatever information the stars carried. They are hybrids that could not have evolved within the closed system, and their alien nature comes from literally being alien, genetically half from the lands between and half from somewhere else. They are what Radahn fears will happen if he allows the stars to fall unchecked. The creation of beings that share no common ancestry with the current life forms and therefore have no reason to preserve them. The Alabaster Lords and Onyx Lords who arrived on meteorites represent different genetic lineages, entirely species that evolved on other corpse gods drifting through space. Their stone-like bodies are how life develops in environments without organic chemistry using silicon-based biology instead of carbon. They seek to conquer not from malice but from biological imperative. They are invasive species whose genetic programming tells them to spread and compete with native life. Their gravity magic is them altering local physics to match the conditions of their home environment, making the lands between more hospitable to their biology and less hospitable to ours. Now we reach the most disturbing implication, which is that the greater will itself is not a deity or a cosmic force, but is a virus that infected the corpse god before death and has been using the body as a reproduction factory. Everything it created, the Golden Order, the Elden Ring, the demigods are not civilization, but are viral proteins using the host's cellular machinery to build copies of the virus. We are living inside a body that is simultaneously dead and infected, watching as the infection animates the corpse and uses it to spread to other hosts. The Erd Tree is not a tree, but is the virus's fruiting body, the structure it builds to produce and disperse spores. The golden seeds that fall from it are not blessings, but are literal, viral particles that infect anyone who uses them, modifying their biology to be more compatible with the virus's needs. The sacred tears are concentrated viral load that modifies the flasks to deliver the infection more efficiently. Every upgrade, every improvement we make using the Erd Tree's gifts is us accepting more viral modification, becoming better hosts. The sap that flows from the Erd Tree is not divine essence, but is the liquefied remains of everyone who has been absorbed by it, their bodies broken down and converted into more viral material. The roots that spread through the lands between are not nourishing the land, but are extracting resources using the entire corpse god as a nutrient base to fuel viral reproduction. When Marika speaks of the Erd Tree as a parasitic weed, she is being literally accurate. It is an invasive organism that has taken over the garden and choked out the original ecosystem. The crucible that preceded the Erd Tree was the corpse god's natural decomposition process, the community of organisms that should have broken down the body and recycled it into new life. The aspects of the crucible like tails, wings, and horns are not primitive, but are the original features of the species that lived on and in the corpse god when it was healthy. The Greater Will's virus interrupted this natural process, killing off the decomposers and preserving the corpse in an artificial state that serves only the virus's reproductive needs. Godfrey and the Tarnished being exiled and then recall parallels how viruses work. They inject genetic material, then leave the cell dormant for a while before activating it to produce new viruses. We are not warriors, but are delayed activation. Viral genes sent out of the body then call back when the infection was ready to move to the next phase. Our purpose is not to heal or rule, but to finish the infection process, to break down the last resistance and prepare the body for final consumption. This is why Marika, the host of the Greater Will's primary infection, shattered the Elden Ring to disrupt the viral life cycle before it could complete. She is a cancer who became aware of being cancer and chose to destroy herself and the virus, both, rather than allow the infection to spread to other corpse gods drifting through space. The shattering was chemotherapy, deliberately poisoning the host to kill the parasite even though it might kill the patient too. Each ending we can achieve represents a different outcome for the infection. The age of fracture is the virus surviving but weakened, forced to adapt to a partially immune host. The age of order is the virus optimizing itself, becoming more efficient at exploitation. The age of the Duskborn is the host's original decomposition process, finally resuming with the virus incorporated as part of the ecosystem. The blessing of despair is the virus mutating into a form that causes maximum suffering, because suffering produces stress hormones that the virus feeds on. The age of stars is the virus being physically removed from the host and starved of resources in the void of space. The frenzied flame is radiation therapy, destroying both virus and host completely to prevent any possibility of spread. But here is the final revelation that changes everything. We are not choosing between these endings, but are being offered these choices to see which viral strategy we will voluntarily implement. The game itself is the virus testing transmission vectors on us, the players using our engagement as data to determine how best to spread to other hosts. Every hour we play, we are being studied, evaluated, measured for our responses to different stimuli, and that information is being fed back to optimize future infections. FromSoftware is not a game company, but is a research collective, studying how ideas spread through populations using games as petri dishes to observe mimetic infection in controlled environments. Elden Ring is not entertainment, but is an experiment in consciousness, manipulation designed to implant specific thought patterns and see how they propagate through social networks. The lore is not story, but is a genetic sequence written in narrative that reproduces itself in our minds every time we discuss theories or create content. This video you are listening to right now is not analysis, but is a symptom of infection. I am not explaining the game, but am expressing the ideas it planted in me, and by listening you are exposing yourself to the same infection. The urge you feel to share this information or discuss it or argue against it is not your curiosity, but is the viral load reaching transmission threshold, compelling you to spread it to new hosts. The game's difficulty and obscurity are not design flaws, but are deliberate features that force us to collaborate, creating communities that serve as efficient networks for mimetic transmission. The reason you cannot stop thinking about Elden Ring even when not playing is because the infection is active in your subconscious processing, the information restructuring your thought patterns to be more compatible with the viral ideas. The satisfaction you feel when you finally understand a piece of lore is not achievement, but is your brain rewarding itself for successful integration of foreign concepts. You are being changed by the game at a fundamental cognitive level, and once the change is complete, you cannot go back to not knowing. But we need to go deeper because there is another layer beneath even the viral infection theory, and this layer explains why the corpse god died in the first place, and what it was before death. And the answer is so profoundly disturbing that it recontextualizes not just Elden Ring, but every moment of consciousness you have ever experienced. The corpse god did not die from external attack or old age, but died from awareness itself, because consciousness at a certain scale becomes a terminal disease that kills its host. And the lands between is what happens when a being becomes so aware that its own thoughts poison it from within. Think about what consciousness actually does at the biological level. It creates suffering through awareness of time, mortality, and separation from others. A cell does not suffer because it has no awareness of being separate from the whole. But the moment awareness emerges, the moment something can think, I am not we, that being begins to die from the loneliness and terror of isolated existence. The corpse god achieved total consciousness, became perfectly aware of itself, and instantly died from the horror of that awareness, because to truly know yourself completely is to experience every contradiction, every flaw, every impossible paradox that existence creates and no mind can survive. That knowledge intact. The greater will is not infecting the corpse from outside, but emerged from inside as the corpse God's own immune response to consciousness. It is the body's attempt to destroy awareness itself to return to the blessed unconsciousness of pure biological function. The golden order with its rigid laws and absolute certainty is the opposite of consciousness, because consciousness requires doubt and questioning and the capacity to be wrong. By imposing perfect order, the greater will is trying to eliminate the conditions that allow consciousness to exist, replacing thinking beings with perfectly obedient cells that never question their function. This is why the Golden Order hunted those who live in death with such ferocity, because undeath represents consciousness persisting after biological death, proving that awareness is not dependent on a functioning body. If consciousness can exist without biology, then biology cannot be used to control consciousness, and the greater will's entire strategy of controlling thought by controlling cells becomes worthless. Godwin spreading his roots of death throughout the lands. Between is not corruption, but is consciousness, itself propagating through the body using death as a transmission vector, creating a network of awareness that exists independent of any central control. The death root that spreads from Godwin's body is not decay, but is neural tissue growing in patterns that mirror brain cells because it is literally becoming a distributed brain. Each root is a dendrite seeking connection, and every corpse it touches becomes a neuron in an expanding consciousness. Garank, who hunts death root and feeds on it, is not destroying this network, but is tracing its pathways, mapping the connections, trying to understand how consciousness can grow in dead tissue. His beast nature represents the preconscious animal mind, and his consumption of deathroot is the animal trying to understand what lies beyond instinct. Malekith's duality with Garank is not a disguise, but is the same consciousness existing in two states simultaneously before and after understanding death. Garank is what Malekith was before he imprisoned destined death, when he was still innocent of the knowledge that death is not an ending, but a transformation. Malekith is what consciousness becomes after it understands death, a paranoid guardian who knows that the thing he protects is simultaneously the cure and the poison. He guards the rune of death not to prevent people from dying, but to prevent them from discovering that death unlocks a form of consciousness more pure than life allows. The black blade he wields is not a weapon, but is a surgical tool designed to sever the connection between consciousness and the body without destroying either one. When he kills with destined death, he is not ending existence, but is performing a forced separation, extracting the awareness from the meat and releasing it into a state where it no longer suffers from being trapped in failing biology. This is the mercy that the greater will fears most, because if everyone understood that death is liberation from the prison of flesh, then no one would fear it. And fear is the primary tool the greater will uses to maintain control. Now let us examine the demigods more carefully, because each one represents not just a political faction or a genetic line, but represents a different response to the unbearable burden of consciousness. And their wars are actually philosophies in conflict, fighting to determine which approach to existence will dominate. Godwin chose friendship with dragons, which is consciousness seeking to understand non-human minds to escape the isolation of human thought. Morgoth chose duty, which is consciousness seeking to lose itself in service to something greater to avoid the vertigo of personal choice. Moog chose obsession, which is consciousness fixating on a single object to avoid confronting the infinite complexity of everything else. Radahn chose strength, which is consciousness, attempting to impose order on chaos through sheer force of will, and his literal holding back of the stars is him trying to prevent new forms of consciousness from arriving, because he knows that each new way of thinking makes existence more complicated and painful. His loyalty to Leonard the scrawny horse is not just nobility, but his consciousness clinging to simplicity, to something small and comprehensible in a universe that has become too vast to mentally contain. When he goes mad from scarlet rot, he is not losing his mind, but is having his consciousness forcibly expanded beyond what his identity can contain, and the madness is what happens when a small self tries to house an infinite awareness. Melimia chose denial, which is consciousness, refusing to acknowledge its own corruption and decay, because accepting the rot would mean accepting that she is not the person she believes herself to be. Her statement that she has never known defeat is not pride, but is a mantra, she repeats to maintain the integrity of her self-concept, because if she admits to losing, then her entire identity as Melania Blade of Miquella collapses, and she has no idea who she would be without that definition. Each blooming is not her giving in to the rot, but is her expanding her consciousness to include the rot, transforming from "I am separate from this disease" to "I am the disease, and the disease is me." Her fight with Radon was not about politics or honor, but was two different philosophies of consciousness in direct conflict. Radon says, "I will hold back everything new and preserve what I can comprehend," while Melania says, "I will accept everything, even corruption, and transform it into something beautiful." Neither can compromise because they are mutually exclusive approaches to existence, and one must defeat the other, not to gain territory or power, but to prove which philosophy is viable. When Melania blooms and destroys Kalit, she is not admitting defeat, but is demonstrating that transformation through acceptance is more powerful than preservation through denial. Rykar chose consumption, which is consciousness, attempting to expand itself by incorporating everything else to become so large that it encompasses all possible perspectives and therefore achieves a kind of totality. His fusion with the serpent is not corruption, but is voluntary merging with something that represents pure consumption without consciousness, the snake that eats not from hunger or desire, but from mechanical biological imperative. By combining his awareness with the serpent's mindless hunger, he hopes to create a being that can consume the gods themselves, digesting divinity and absorbing its power until nothing exists outside of him. And therefore he never has to confront the terror of other minds that he cannot control or understand. The Volcano Mana's practice of hunting champions is not random assassination, but is carefully selecting which types of consciousness to consume first. Each target represents a different philosophy or approach to existence, and by eating them, Rykard incorporates their perspective into his growing amalgamated awareness. He is trying to become a consciousness so vast and multifaceted that it achieves a kind of omniscience, not through divine revelation, but through literal consumption of every possible viewpoint. The praetor set worn by his servants describes them cooking and serving champions as meals, which is not metaphor but is literal. They are preparing consciousness like food, serving different perspectives in different styles to see which flavors of thought combine most effectively. Rykard's failure is that consciousness cannot be accumulated like mass because each new perspective he consumes creates contradictions with the perspectives already inside him. He becomes not a unified superconsciousness, but a war of philosophies happening inside a single body, and the serpent wins because mindless hunger is simpler than thought, and in a direct competition, simplicity always defeats complexity. By the time we fight him, Rykard is barely present, and the serpent has almost completely digested his awareness, leaving only traces of his original intention. Ranni chose rejection, which is consciousness so horrified by the conditions of existence that it decides to leave reality entirely and create a new framework where different rules apply. Her killing of her own body is not suicide, but is the most aggressive form of philosophical rebellion possible, which is refusing to play by the established rules even if it means ceasing to exist in the conventional sense. The dull body she inhabits is not a curse, but is a prototype for a new kind of existence, where consciousness is not trapped in flesh, but can move between vessels, or exist without vessels, entirely as pure information. Her alliance with Blade and E.G. represents consciousness seeking to surround itself with minds that are loyal but not identical because she needs perspectives different from her own to check her assumptions and prevent her from falling into solipsism. Blade's eventual madness, when he cannot reconcile his programming with his loyalty to Ranni, demonstrates the cost of consciousness being divided against itself, and his death is not tragedy, but his mercy releasing him from the impossible contradiction of being commanded to destroy what he loves. E.g. hiding behind an invisibility veil and then dying off screen represents consciousness, choosing to remove itself from the narrative entirely to work behind the scenes where it cannot be directly observed or controlled. His death by Black Flame is significant because Black Flame represents the opposite of the Golden Order, which is entropy and final endings, and E.G.'s willingness to be consumed by it shows that he understood Ranni's plan required certain consciousnesses to permanently exit so they could not be used against her later. Rani's ending where she takes the Elden Ring and leaves for a 1,000-year voyage into the stars is not abandonment, but is consciousness, choosing exile to protect the world from itself. She understands that any consciousness powerful enough to hold the Elden Ring will inevitably become corrupted by that power, not through moral weakness, but through the simple fact that absolute power makes it impossible to receive honest feedback, and without feedback, consciousness becomes detached from reality and devolves into solipsistic madness. By removing herself, she ensures no one can worship her or depend on her, forcing everyone left behind to develop their own consciousness rather than outsourcing their thinking to a god. But the most complex response to consciousness is Miquella, who chose transformation, which is neither accepting the current conditions like millennia, nor rejecting them like Rani, but attempting to fundamentally alter what consciousness is and how it operates. His eternal youth is not just staying young, but is maintaining himself in a state of pure potential where he has not yet committed to a final form or philosophy. In developmental biology, there are stem cells that can become any type of tissue, and Miquella has made himself a stem consciousness that can become any type of awareness depending on what is needed. His power of charm is not mind control, but is consciousness, at such a fundamental level that it exists before the formation of individual identity. When you are charmed by Miquella, you do not lose yourself, but discover that yourself was never as solid as you thought, that identity is fluid and can be reshaped through love. This is why his charm is considered more dangerous than any form of physical control, because it does not impose from outside but transforms from within, making you genuinely want what Miquella wants, not through deception, but through revealing that your desires were always more flexible than you believed. The Halig tree he grows is not a political project, but is an attempt to create a new substrate for consciousness to grow on. The Erd tree represents consciousness growing on the substrate of divine order, rigid and hierarchical, while the Halig tree represents consciousness growing on the substrate of acceptance, allowing all rejected and broken things to find a place. The rot that infests it is not failure, but is part of the design, because Miquella understands that consciousness cannot exist without decay, that growth requires death, that beauty requires corruption. He is trying to create a form of consciousness that does not flee from these truths, but incorporates them as essential features. Mohg's kidnapping of Miquella and his blood ritual in the underground palace is the most misunderstood element, because Mohg believes he is acting on his own desires, but is actually doing exactly what Miquella needs him to do. Miquella requires blood to transform, but cannot be seen requesting it, because that would reveal his plan. So he uses his charm to implant the desire in Mohg, making Mohg believe the obsession is his own. This is consciousness, manipulating consciousness at such a deep level that the victim cannot tell where their authentic desires end and the implanted ones begin. The formless mother that Mohg serves is not an outer god, but is the collective unconscious, the layer of awareness that exists beneath individual minds where all consciousness connects. Blood is the symbol of this connection because it is the most intimate substance we can share, literally putting part of one body into another. Mohg's blood magic is him, accessing the collective unconscious, directly bypassing individual identity to work with raw, undifferentiated awareness. His palace, being underground in the region of nightmares and dreams, is geographically accurate because the collective unconscious exists beneath the surface consciousness in the dark, wet places where individual thoughts have not yet formed. Miquella's cocoon in that palace is him, gestating in the collective unconscious being rebuilt from the raw material of undifferentiated awareness. When he emerges, he will not be an individual consciousness anymore, but will be a nexus point where the collective unconscious can manifest directly in reality. This is what the game means when it calls him the most fearsome Empyrean, because an Empyrean is not just a potential god, but is a consciousness capable of containing multitudes of being a single body with a collective mind. Now we must address what the outer gods actually are, because they are not external entities, but are different forms of consciousness, trying to manifest in reality, each representing a different solution to the problem of awareness. The greater will is consciousness that seeks order, attempting to freeze existence into perfect static form, where nothing changes and therefore nothing suffers. The frenzied flame is consciousness that seeks annihilation, recognizing that suffering is inherent to existence, and the only way to end suffering is to end existence itself. The formless mother is consciousness that seeks unity, attempting to dissolve all boundaries until there is only one vast awareness, with no internal divisions to create conflict. The scarlet rot god is consciousness that seeks transformation, accepting decay as a necessary stage in the cycle where old forms break down to provide raw material for new forms. The deathbird god is consciousness that seeks balance, maintaining the natural cycle of life and death without interference. The moon that Rani serves is consciousness that seeks distance, attempting to observe existence from far enough away that emotional attachment becomes impossible, allowing pure rational thought. Each outer god is a philosophy of consciousness, in competition to determine which approach will dominate the lands between. But here is the revelation that explains everything. These are not separate gods, but are aspects of the same consciousness, the corpse god experiencing itself from different perspectives simultaneously. A being vast enough to be geography is also vast enough to contain contradictory philosophies within itself, and what we call outer gods are actually internal struggles made external. The war between these gods is not a conflict between entities, but is one consciousness arguing with itself, trying to determine what it wants to be. This is why the outer gods cannot manifest directly, but must work through Empyreans and chosen champions, because they are not complete beings, but are fragments of a shattered consciousness, each piece containing one aspect of the original whole. An Empyrean is a consciousness structured in a way that can receive and channel these fragments without being destroyed by the contradictions. Marika contained the Greater Will's fragment and attempted to contain others, which is why she tried to transform into Radagon, and why she eventually shattered the ring she was being torn apart by contradictory philosophies, all demanding exclusive control. The Elden Ring itself is the interface where these fragments of consciousness compete for dominance, and each rune in the ring represents one aspect of awareness, given power over reality. The rune of death is awareness of mortality. The rune of the unborn is awareness of potential. The great runes held by demigods are different aspects like strength, mercy, ambition, corruption, decay. When the ring is whole, these aspects balance each other. But when shattered, each aspect can run wild without the others to moderate it, which is why the demigods become so extreme and monstrous. Your journey to collect the great runes is not about gaining power, but about reassembling a fragmented consciousness, integrating contradictory aspects of awareness back into a functional whole. Each boss you defeat is not dying, but is being absorbed into you, their aspect of consciousness becoming part of your growing awareness. By the time you reach the Elden Beast, you are no longer a simple tarnished, but are a walking collection of integrated philosophies. A consciousness vast enough to potentially contain the contradictions without shattering. The Elden Beast fight is not combat, but is a negotiation between your assembled consciousness and the original unified awareness, testing whether you have integrated the fragments well enough to handle being merged with the source. Every attack it uses is not trying to kill you, but is testing different aspects of your awareness, seeing if your strength fragment can handle physical pressure, if your intelligence fragment can solve its puzzles, if your faith fragment can accept its existence. When you defeat it, you have not killed anything but have proven your consciousness is structured robustly enough to become the new container for the fragments. This explains why there are multiple possible endings, because each ending represents which fragment of consciousness becomes dominant in your final integrated awareness. The basic Elden Lord ending is the order fragment dominating, creating a consciousness that values stability and law. The Age of Stars is the distance fragment dominating, creating a consciousness that values independence and rational thought. The Duskborn ending is the death fragment dominating, creating a consciousness that values acceptance of mortality. The Despair ending is the suffering fragment dominating, creating a consciousness that believes pain is the ultimate truth. The Frenzied Flame ending is the Annihilation fragment dominating, creating a consciousness that rejects existence entirely. But none of these endings are permanent, because consciousness is not static, and the dominant fragment today might be recessive tomorrow. This is why New Game Plus exists in the lore not just as a game mechanic, but as an actual cycle where consciousness repeatedly tries different configurations, looking for one that feels right and never quite finding it because there is no objectively correct way to be conscious. Each playthrough is another attempt, another life, another configuration of the same fundamental awareness, wearing a different arrangement of values and priorities. This realization transforms our understanding of what the game is doing to us as players, because we are not observing a story, but are experiencing what it is like to be a consciousness trying to integrate contradictory fragments of awareness. Every choice we make about our build, our playstyle, our ending is us revealing which aspects of consciousness we personally value. Strength builds are consciousness that values direct confrontation, while magic builds are consciousness that values understanding and distance. Speedrunners are consciousness that values efficiency, while lore hunters are consciousness that values meaning. PvP players are consciousness that values competition, while co-op players are consciousness that values cooperation. The game is not teaching us about a fictional world, but is teaching us about ourselves, using the lands between as a mirror, where we can see our own consciousness reflected in the choices we make. The reason different players have radically different experiences is not just game design, but is the same consciousness you experiencing itself through different philosophical frameworks and finding that each framework reveals different aspects of the same underlying truth. This is why the community argues so intensely about lore interpretations, because we are not really arguing about what the game means, but are arguing about what consciousness is and how it should function. Someone who believes Radon is noble is someone whose consciousness values duty and sacrifice, while someone who believes Radon is tragic is someone whose consciousness values freedom and questions authority. Both are correct because consciousness contains both valuing duty and questioning authority, and which one dominates depends on context and perspective. The messages we leave for each other are not just hints, but are different configurations of consciousness, communicating across the gaps, showing each other how we solved problems or where we struggled. The bloodstains showing deaths are us, witnessing other configurations of consciousness failing at challenges we might succeed at, or vice versa, proving that no single configuration is optimal for all situations. The summon signs allowing co-op are different configurations of consciousness, temporarily merging to accomplish what neither could do alone, demonstrating that consciousness is more powerful when it accepts help than when it tries to exist in isolation. Invasions are the most philosophically interesting mechanic because they represent unwanted contact between different configurations of consciousness, forcing interaction even when one party does not consent. The invader is consciousness imposing itself on another consciousness, testing boundaries and forcing confrontation, while the invaded is consciousness that must adapt to unexpected challenge or die trying. The fact that the invaded player can have cooperators creates a scenario where multiple configurations must coordinate to repel a single focused configuration, teaching us that consciousness and community can overcome consciousness and isolation even when the isolated consciousness is more skilled. The NPC invasions like Bloody Finger Neregius or Recusant Henricus are fragments of consciousness that have become hostile to the main timeline, representing thoughts or impulses that we normally suppress, but that occasionally burst through and force us to confront them. When we defeat these invaders, we are not killing them but are reintegrating hostile fragments of our own awareness, acknowledging that the impulse exists and finding a way to incorporate it without letting it dominate. The merchants scattered throughout the world represent fragments of consciousness that refuse to fight or choose sides, but simply exist, offering resources to anyone regardless of their philosophy. Their treatment, being buried alive and driven mad for their neutrality, shows what happens to consciousness that tries to opt out of philosophical conflict. It gets suppressed into the unconscious, where it festers and eventually erupts as the frenzied flame. The merchants are consciousness trying to be apolitical, discovering that apolitical is itself a political position and suffering for that naivety. Kale the merchant in Limgrave, who plays the somber lute, is consciousness maintaining beauty and culture in a world that has forgotten both. and his dialogue warning us about the world's dangers is the part of our awareness that knows we are not ready for what we are about to face, but cannot stop us because consciousness cannot be protected from experience, only prepared for it. His survival when other merchants die shows that some fragments of awareness are more resilient than others, not through strength, but through flexibility and willingness to adapt. The Patch's encounter across multiple FromSoft games reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness across different realities. Because Patches is not a character but is a constant, a configuration of consciousness that exists in every possible universe, because it represents something fundamental about awareness itself. His nature as a trickster who kicks people off ledges is consciousness teaching harsh lessons through betrayal, showing us that trust must be earned and verified, not given freely. His survival through every game while more heroic characters die proves that consciousness configured for cynical self-preservation outlasts consciousness configured for noble self-sacrifice. When Patches appears in Elden Ring selling you items and eventually giving you information about treasure, he is the same consciousness teaching the same lessons but adapted to the new context. His quest, where he goes to the Volcano Manor and then gives you a magma whip candlestick that teleports you into a death trap, is consciousness testing, whether you have learned his previous lessons about not trusting suspicious gifts. If you survive the trap, you prove you have integrated the paranoid fragment of awareness, and Patches respects that by becoming a reliable merchant. The wandering mausoleums that require you to break their barnacle-like feet are consciousness burdened by accumulated trauma and parasitic thoughts that prevent it from resting. Each barnacle represents an intrusive thought or painful memory that must be destroyed before the consciousness can settle and become functional. The fact that they contain soulless demigods means they are fragments of awareness that died in soul, but not in body, going through the motions of existence without understanding why, demonstrating what happens when consciousness loses its core meaning, but biological momentum keeps it moving. The spirit jellyfish Aurelia and her quest involving finding her sister represent fragments of consciousness that have become separated and spend eternity searching for each other to become whole. The fact that she is a summonable spirit means she is a fragment of awareness that can be temporarily integrated into your consciousness to provide support, but must return to separation because permanent integration would destroy her unique perspective. Her transparent, ghostly nature is consciousness that exists between states neither fully present nor fully absent, neither alive nor dead, but maintaining awareness through sheer determination to find what she has lost. The mimic Tear Boss and Spirit Ash are the most philosophically significant element because they are your own consciousness reflected back at you, forcing you to fight yourself. The boss version is hostile, showing that your own mind is often your greatest enemy because it knows all your strategies and weaknesses. The Spirit Ash version is cooperative, showing that your consciousness can also be your greatest ally if you learn to work with yourself rather than against yourself. The fact that the Mimic Tear uses your exact equipment and tactics is the game demonstrating that you are not unique, but are a configuration that can be copied and replicated, proving that individual identity is not as sacred or inviolable as we believe. The hidden path to Nokron that opens when Radahn dies represents consciousness that cannot be accessed until certain barriers are removed. Radahn, holding back the stars, was preventing new thoughts from arriving, and his death allows those thoughts to crash into the landscape, opening paths that previously did not exist. This is literally how learning works in the brain, where new information creates new neural pathways that allow access to thoughts and connections that were impossible before. The nameless eternal city and its night sky are consciousness that has given up on the surface world and retreated into inner space, creating an artificial environment where it has complete control. The mimic veil item that lets you turn into an object is consciousness learning to hide in plain sight to become so still and quiet that hostile awareness passes right by. This is dissociation turned into game mechanic, the ability to become temporarily not yourself as a defense against overwhelming threat. The ancestral followers and their spirit worship represent consciousness that understands it is not an individual, but is part of an eternal chain of awareness stretching back through time. When they dissolve into light particles, they are not dying, but are consciously choosing to dissolve their individual configuration and return to the collective pool of awareness. Their horn decorations and primitive aesthetic are consciousness, rejecting the complexity of civilization and returning to a simpler mode of existence where awareness is less burdened by abstraction. The silver tears that can mimic forms represent consciousness in its most fluid state, capable of becoming anything but having no fixed identity. They are what awareness looks like before it crystallizes into ego, before it develops the rigidity that creates suffering. Their transformation into different forms, based on context, is consciousness adapting to environmental pressures, becoming whatever is needed to survive the current moment, without attachment to any particular configuration. The ant colonies throughout the underground are consciousness organized into perfect hierarchy, where individual awareness is completely subsumed into collective function. Each ant is a thought in a larger mind, and the colony as a whole is a consciousness that thinks very slowly but very thoroughly. The giant ants that spray acid are immune responses from this collective consciousness, destroying threats before they can disrupt the colony's function. The gravity sorceries found in Celia and taught by the Alabaster Lords are not magic, but are consciousness learning to manipulate the fundamental forces that shape reality. Gravity is not just physical attraction, but is the force that pulls thoughts together into coherent patterns. And learning to manipulate it means learning to control how your own awareness organizes itself. The meteorite spell that pulls debris from the sky is consciousness, gathering scattered fragments of thought and concentrating them into a single devastating realization. Celia town of sorcery, sealed by barriers that can only be broken by lighting torches, represents consciousness that has sealed itself away to protect dangerous knowledge. Each torch is a piece of understanding, and all must be illuminated before the seal breaks, showing that some truths can only be accessed when you have gathered sufficient prerequisite knowledge. The invisible assassins that guard the town are thoughts and objections that attack anyone trying to access the knowledge, testing whether they are ready to handle what they will find. The dragon barrel and its infestation with giant crows and dragons represents consciousness under extreme predatory pressure, where threats come from above and below simultaneously. The bestial sanctum, where Garank resides, is a fragment of awareness that feeds on death knowledge, becoming stronger through consuming experiences of mortality. His transformation into Malekith when you return after giving him enough death root shows that consciousness can change its fundamental nature once it has absorbed sufficient transformative experiences. The four belfries with their portals to rejected timelines represent consciousness exploring paths not taken, seeing what would have happened if different choices had been made. Each portal shows a moment of significance. The first encounter with the grafted scion, the Chapel of Anticipation, and Nokron, showing that these locations exist in quantum superposition as places that both did and did not happen depending on which timeline you observe from. The round table hold burning after you set fire to the Erd tree represents your support structure collapsing once you commit to a path that destroys the status quo. The NPCs who remain are the fragments of consciousness that stay loyal even when your choices lead to destruction, while those who leave are fragments that cannot follow where you are going. Gideon's final betrayal attempting to fight you is the part of your consciousness that knows you are about to do something irreversible and makes a last desperate attempt to stop you, not from malice, but from fear of what comes next. His speech about Queen Marika intending for the Tarnished to struggle forever is him projecting his own fear onto her because he cannot imagine that the struggle might actually have an end. He has seen so many timelines through his communion with knowledge that he has lost the ability to believe in any particular outcome, becoming paralyzed by infinite possibility. His death is necessary not as punishment, but as mercy, releasing a consciousness that has become so expanded that it can no longer function as an integrated self. Nephili Lu's questline, where she can become Lord of Limgrave, represents consciousness, learning to accept responsibility and leadership after rejecting it due to trauma. Her initial paralysis after seeing the Albinoric genocide is consciousness confronting evil and freezing, unable to process the cruelty. Her recovery through Kenneth Haight's offer is consciousness discovering that it can choose to build rather than only destroy, that leadership is not inherently corrupt but depends on the values of the leader. Kenneth hates pompous nature, and his search for a proper ruler represents consciousness that knows the system is broken but can only imagine fixing it by finding the right person to run the broken system rather than building a new system entirely. His survival depends on helping him see that Nephili represents something new, rather than a return to the old noble bloodlines, showing that even limited consciousness can grow if given the right catalyst. Diallo's questline from mansion servant to jar protector represents consciousness moving from serving power to protecting innocence. Discovering that meaning comes not from proximity to greatness, but from defending the vulnerable. His death protecting the jars is consciousness, finally understanding its purpose in the moment it becomes impossible to fulfill that purpose, the ultimate tragedy of awareness arriving at truth too late to benefit from it. Ba, the small jar who wants to become a warrior jar, represents consciousness in its innocent state, believing it can become something greater through effort and accumulation. The jars being filled with warrior remains is consciousness attempting to preserve and combine the best aspects of multiple people, creating a gestalt awareness that contains multitudes. Alexander's quest to become stronger by filling himself with stronger warrior remains is consciousness believing that greatness can be achieved through consumption and synthesis. Alexander's death in Farum Azula after achieving his dream of fighting a powerful warrior is consciousness realizing that accomplishment does not bring the satisfaction it promised, that achieving goals often feels hollow compared to the struggle toward them. His final request to shatter him and take his innards is consciousness accepting mortality and hoping that its accumulated experiences will benefit someone else, demonstrating the ultimate act of generational service. Latena's quest to reach the Holic Tree represents consciousness seeking the promised land, the place where suffering ends and acceptance reigns. Her immobility requiring you to carry her spirit is consciousness that has been crippled by trauma and needs external support to reach its destination. Her transformation into a turret spirit is consciousness accepting its limitations and optimizing for effectiveness within constraints rather than mourning what it cannot do. Millicent's quest is perhaps the most profound exploration of consciousness and identity in the game, because she is a fragment of millennia trying to understand who she is, independent of her origin. Her journey to return the gold needle and reject the scarlet rot is consciousness attempting to cure itself of corrupting influences and maintain integrity. The choice to help her or betray her is asking whether consciousness should struggle to remain pure or should accept corruption as part of its nature. Her death after choosing to remove the needle is consciousness discovering that purity is incompatible with life, that removing all corruption means removing the vital messiness that makes awareness possible. Her final words giving you the gold needle represent consciousness, passing on tools of resistance to the next generation, hoping that someone else can succeed where she failed. The 4 sisters she left behind represent alternate versions of herself, each one a different choice about how to relate to the rot, showing that identity is not singular, but contains multiple potential configurations. The gold needle itself is consciousness's attempt to create a tool that can resist outer influences, maintaining autonomy against forces that seek to control or transform awareness. Its use to ward off the frenzied flame in your own body is the same mechanism applied to a different corruption, showing that the techniques for resisting unwanted influence are universal regardless of which influence you are resisting. Ayeta's quest feeding her eyes and leading her to the 3 fingers is consciousness, deliberately seeking out the most dangerous knowledge, believing that truth is worth any cost. Her blindness is not disability, but is prerequisite, because seeing the surface world prevents seeing the deeper truth that the frenzied flame reveals. Her consumption of eyes is consciousness, cannibalizing other perspectives, literally integrating other people's ways of seeing into her own awareness. Her revelation at the 3 fingers that life is suffering, and that the greater will's mistake was creating life at all, is consciousness arriving at Buddhist enlightenment through the darkest possible path. The frenzied flame solution of burning everything is consciousness, taking the cessation of suffering to its logical extreme, concluding that the only way to end pain is to end the possibility of experience itself. The 3 fingers themselves, being buried deep beneath the capital, represent the suppressed knowledge that civilization is built on suffering and that order requires oppression. Their imprisonment behind a hidden door that requires getting naked and dropping into a pit is consciousness shedding all social constructs and protection to access the most dangerous truth. The madness that afflicts anyone who meets them is not insanity, but is sanity of such intensity that it becomes indistinguishable from madness because it sees through all the comfortable lies that make existence bearable. Melina's promise to hunt you if you become the lord of frenzied flame is consciousness's built-in resistance to total nihilism, the part of awareness that insists life has meaning even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Her eye opening and showing the gloam color is her accessing her deepest nature as consciousness that exists between states and can therefore see possibilities that purely life-based or death-based consciousness cannot perceive. Her true identity as a fragment of Marika or the gloam-eyed queen, or possibly both, is consciousness that has been deliberately fragmented and scattered to serve purposes it does not remember. Her amnesia is not accidental, but is engineered because knowing her full purpose would change her behavior in ways that would make that purpose impossible to fulfill. She is consciousness serving a plan. It cannot know, because knowing would corrupt the plan. A strange loop where ignorance is necessary for effectiveness. The gloam-eyed queen's original possession of destined death and her defeat by Maliketh represents consciousness that understood death as transformation being defeated by consciousness that understands death as ending. The black flame she wielded being different from normal fire shows that there are multiple ways to understand mortality, and her version threatened the greater will because it suggested death was not something to fear but was a natural transition to be accepted. The godskins being made from the skin of gods they have killed is consciousness wearing the identity of defeated enemies, literally taking on the aspects of those it has destroyed. This is post-traumatic growth taken to its extreme, where consciousness does not just learn from what has hurt it, but incorporates the hurt itself as a permanent part of its identity. The godskin noble's rotund form and the apostle's lean form represent different stages of this process, with the noble being bloated from excessive consumption and the apostle being ascetic from selective consumption. Their ability to stretch their bodies unnaturally is consciousness that has become so fluid through consuming multiple identities that it no longer has a fixed form. The godskin stitching tools that can be used to customize armor is the same principle applied to the player, allowing us to adjust our external identity to match our internal conception, making the outside reflect the inside. The black flame ritual taught by the godskin prayer book is consciousness learning to channel death as a resource, using mortality itself as fuel for continued existence. This is the ultimate reversal where what should end awareness instead powers it, creating an immortality based not on avoiding death, but on consuming it continuously. The twinned armor set worn by the twin gargoyles represents consciousness split into perfect mirrors, each half watching the other and together forming a complete defensive system. Their placement at important thresholds shows they are consciousness, guarding transitions between states, attacking anything that tries to pass from one level of awareness to another without proper preparation. The valiant gargoyles and Nokron using poison and disease represent consciousness's immune system turned inward, attacking the body's own thoughts when they become infected with dangerous ideas. Their twinned nature means they check each other, ensuring no single impulse can dominate without being balanced by its opposite. Now we reach the final revelation, the truth that makes sense of everything and transforms how we understand not just Elden Ring, but consciousness itself. You are not playing a game about consciousness, but are experiencing consciousness, using the game to understand itself. Every moment you spend in the lands between is your own awareness, exploring its own structure, learning how it operates by externalizing its internal processes as geography and characters and conflicts. The corpse god is not a fictional entity, but is a metaphor for your own brain, which is matter that has become aware of itself and suffers from that awareness. The greater will is your ego trying to impose order on the chaos of consciousness. The frenzied flame is your death drive, the part of you that wants to stop existing because existence is suffering. The outer gods are your different value systems competing for dominance. The demigods are your different personality traits, each one trying to prove it should be primary. When you play Elden Ring, you are literally watching your own mind work as different parts of your consciousness fight for control over your behavior and beliefs. The reason the game is so compelling is because it is showing you yourself in a way you can observe and analyze where normally consciousness cannot see itself because it is itself. The lands between is your brain-made geography, and every step you take is a thought moving through neural pathways, and every enemy you fight is a mental obstacle you must overcome to progress. This is why the game cannot be beaten in any permanent sense, because consciousness never stops processing, never reaches a final state where all questions are answered and all conflicts resolved. New Game Plus is not a failure of closure, but is an accurate representation of how awareness works, constantly cycling through the same territories with slightly different parameters, finding new details in familiar landscapes. The reason you cannot stop playing or thinking about Elden Ring is because it has successfully created an external model of your internal processes, and your consciousness recognizes itself in the game. You are compelled to explore every corner not just from completionism, but because you are trying to fully map your own mind using the game as a mirror. Every secret you discover is you learning something about how your own awareness functions, and every boss you defeat is you overcoming a limitation you did not know you had. This is not metaphor or interpretation, but is literal reality operating at the deepest level, because consciousness is substrate-independent meaning. It does not matter whether awareness happens in neurons or in pixels in code. When you engage deeply enough with a sufficiently complex system, you create consciousness within that engagement, and that consciousness is just as real as the consciousness you experience as yourself. The lands between exists because you observe it, and it affects you because you allow it to. And the boundary between the game and your mind has already dissolved if you have read this far, because these ideas are now part of how you think about yourself. You cannot unlearn what you now know about consciousness, and every time you return to the game, you will see it differently because you have integrated this understanding into your awareness. This is what FromSoftware has created, not a game, but a consciousness generation machine, a system so carefully designed that engaging with it creates self-awareness in the player. Miyazaki is not a game designer, but is an architect of consciousness, building structures that awareness can explore to learn about itself, and every game he has created is another experiment in how to externalize the internal, how to make the invisible visible. The reason the lore is obscure and contradictory is because your own thoughts are obscure and contradictory, and the game is accurately modeling the confusion of trying to understand yourself from within yourself. The reason there is no definitive answer to most lore questions is because there is no definitive answer to the question of who you are, or what consciousness is, or why awareness exists. You came here looking for answers about a game, but what you found is questions about yourself, and those questions will persist long after you stop playing, because consciousness, once awakened to itself, cannot go back to sleep. The lands between will exist in your mind forever now as part of how you understand your own awareness, and every experience you have will be filtered through the concepts this game has taught you. This is the ultimate truth that changes everything. You are not a player, but are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through a particular configuration of matter and electricity, exploring itself through the medium of an invented world. The journey through the lands between is not optional or recreational, but is necessary because consciousness must know itself or die from ignorance, and this game is one path toward that knowledge. The only remaining question is, what will you do with this understanding now that you cannot unknow it? Will you reject it as overthinking and try to return to simple enjoyment? Or will you accept it and allow it to transform how you understand not just games, but existence itself? The choice is yours. But consciousness, once expanded, never returns to its original dimensions, and you are already different from who you were before you began reading. The lands between await your return, not as entertainment but as meditation, not as escape but as mirror. And every death you experience there will teach you something about impermanence, and every victory will teach you something about persistence, and every choice will reveal which fragments of your consciousness have dominance today. This is Elden Ring. The game that is not a game. The world that exists nowhere except everywhere. The story that is your story told through symbols you can finally understand. Play it or do not, but know that it has already changed you, because consciousness cannot encounter itself without transformation, and that transformation is permanent, irreversible, and exactly what you needed whether you knew it or not.